Okay, so in the previous tutorial we have seen how to create this guest post by ID method, and now let's see how to create create post method, right? Okay, so yeah, so I will create a new function as create post with request response cycle, and yeah, so this function will create a post for me. So I need to specify this on my routes as well, but before that I need to export this function, and I need to import it in my routes, and I can simply call a route like this, but it must be having post method, because post method stands for creating some object within our backend, right? So when it invokes create method, when it invoke the post HTTP method, it must call create post function like this. Then it will go to the create post and it will create the specific post, right? But in here, if you are creating a specific post object, we have to send that object inside our request body. So in the previous tutorial we have seen how we can send a request parameter like this, and now let's see how to consume a request body. So all we have to do is basically specify it as req.body, right? So then this will take our payload, a request payload. So I can go to the postman again, and I will create a new request, and let's rename it as create post. So the same URL, but we don't need this ID anymore, and its method is post, and I have to send a body with a raw type of JSON payload. And let's say I'm having sort of a similar JSON payload like this, so let's say ID, I don't need to send the ID because ID needs to be auto generated, and created that needs to be auto generated. All I need to send is title and the content. So let's say post, I don't know, let's say new post, and sample content for new post. And if I send it back, you can see it is still undefined, because again, when you are sending this specific JSON payload, we have to explicitly say to Express, okay, now consume a JSON payload, right? Yeah, so in order to do that, basically we have to go for our app.js, then we have to tell to Express to consume JSON payload, right? So all we have to do is basically add this line. So app.use express.json, then whatever request that you are sending through your payload, with the payload, it will basically consume as a JSON object, right? So now if I invoke the same method again, now you can see it returns, or it logs this JSON payload. So simply because it is consume HTTP request body as a JSON payload over here, right? So I will cancel this request. So now as the next step, what we have to do is basically we have to construct a JSON payload, a JSON object. So first step is basically create a JSON object. Then second step is basically save the object, and third step is return the newly created object back to the user, right? So in the first step we have to create a JSON object. So in order to construct a JSON object, all you have to do is you have to call object dot assign with specific JSON payload, right? So this JSON payload have an ID, right? So any sort of ID, and it has a title, right? And that title comes from request.body.title, and we need content, and contents come from request.body.content, and it has created at time. So created at time can be anything. So let's say it is date.now. So basically this will return the current date. So created at will be the current date. But of course we need to generate ID as well. So you can maybe generate a random number over here. But what I'm going to do is basically I will generate a sequence of ID numbers based on my post.json. So here if you look at this ID, it is iterating one by one, right? So all I have to do is basically I need to iterate or I need to add 1 to the latest post. So all I have to do is basically take this object and read the ID and add 1 to it. Then I will be having the new ID. So let's see how we can do that. So I will create a new variable, a constant with new ID. So I will read sample post, and I need to obtain the last post, right? So sample post by 1 means this is sample post dot length. Actually sample post dot length minus 1 means the index is basically 2 now. So sample post 2 means this object, and inside that object I need to read ID. So dot ID, and I need to add 1 to it. Then I will be having a new ID, right? So then I can assign new ID like this. So now I can lock this post, and let's invoke this method again, and you can see we have the ID as 3, and the created time or created at is basically the current time or current date, right? So cancel this request. So now the first step is done. Then what we have to do is basically we have to save the object, right? So in order to save a file, we can use fs.write file. So in this write file we have to basically pass 3 properties. First thing is the file path, and the data that we need to save, and the callback function. So if we have any other options, we can specify that as well, but mainly we need the file path and the data and the callback function. Okay, so data is basically a new sample post, right? So a new sample post means it needs to be added this new post as well. So therefore, before saving this new post, we need to push this JSON object to this array. So all I have to do is basically sample post dot push this new post. Then the new array will be having this JSON object as well. So once it has this object, we can save that array over here. Then once it is saved, okay, so this is data. So before we are going to save it, we need to specify the file path. So file path is same as this path, so I will just simply copy it and paste it over here. Then sample post, then I need to specify a callback function like this, right? So inside the callback function, there are two things can happen. First thing is basically a file can be written successfully, which means the operation is done. Otherwise it can return an error, right? So for now, let's say the operation works correctly. Therefore all I have to do is basically return a response like in this one. So I will just copy it and paste it over there, and let's say success, and let's return new post, right? So basically I'm doing the third step inside this function as well. So let's paste that object, paste that step over here, right? So I will format the document. Okay, so I think it will work correctly, and let's execute this function. So I will first show you the current post JSON file, and if I invoke this function, okay, I think we have an error. Argument must be type string or instance of buffer type array, right? Okay, so error is basically we are saving this sample post as it is. So basically this sample post is a JSON parsed payload, right? And we need to convert it back to this specific format, which means we have to stringify it, right? So basically the opposite of this process. So opposite of this process is basically JSON is stringifying. So inside this line we can say JSON.stringify the sample post. So it will be somewhat transformed into a format that is readable like this. Okay, now let's try to invoke the method again. Okay, now the method is invoking correctly and it returns the new post, and let's see our post.json as well. Okay, so you can see that the structure has been changed because it rewrites the existing file. So I will simply format the document. Okay, now you can see that is our new post. Okay, so that's how it works correctly. But let's say there is some error while writing this file, which means it shouldn't return this new post back to user. So we can specify it as like this by calling error, right? And let's say if there is an error, and it must return a failure like this. So I will copy that line and paste it over here, and let's say post not created. Okay, so for instance we won't be having any errors, but in case if we have some sort of IO error, this will return this post not created function, right? So let's say post something like this. So such a file doesn't exist, this directory. So let's try to invoke that. Okay. Yeah, I think yeah, it doesn't work correctly over there, because it check this directory and such a file doesn't exist, but however that operation works without an error, therefore it won't be returning any sort of error over here. But let's say in case if it has any error, it will go back to this line and it will return this failure method. But of course I don't think setting up error over here will be useful, so I will simply remove it, right, and I will use the default callback function, because that is an exception we need to handle globally, right? So it is not coming under callback function, so that exception we need to handle explicitly inside our application. So I will show you how this stuff happen when it comes to error handling chapter, but for now our functionality works correctly, which is a saving or creating a specific post object, right? So that is for now, and the next video I will show you how to update this newly created post or any other existing post.